which was in biodiversity exploration and research. He founded the Wildlife Heritage Trust of Sri Lanka in 1989 and worked to restore the degraded forests in the island's montane regions. He has been a tireless advocate for the conservation of ecosystems in our shared homeland and across many other tropical regions, drawing attention to the lasting impacts of colonization and parachute science on conservation. He has served many national and international organizations, including the Species Survival Commission and the International Trust for Zoological Nomenclature. He is the author of more books and papers than he cares to count. He is a recipient of the Rolex Award for Enterprise and only the second Asian ever to be honored with the Linnean Medal for Zoology. In recent years, he has stood out as an outspoken advocate for human rights, transparent governance, and sustainable development. As we sit through today's talk, I want all of us to think about the institutional power that we hold in the space that we are at. Many of the issues in the field of environment transect geographical boundaries and timescales, and they require us to look back and reflect, which is just as important as looking forward. And for this reason, Rohan has decided to speak today about how relatively small actions by developed nations, particularly the United States, can have profound and lasting impacts for small, less powerful nations, undermining the foundational principles of sustainable development. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rohan Pethiyagoda.
Thank you, Rohan. Thank you, Oditha. I'm going to talk today about 5 parables drawn from my experience as a citizen of a small developing nation. Developing nations are politely called that because we don't like calling them failed states unless you're Donald Trump. And a book that helped me understand the predicament of countries like Sri Lanka was this one. Some of you might have read Acemoglu and Robinson's Why Nations Fail. What I'm going to do is try to add to their thesis, which was largely that nations fail because of their weak institutions. This is the difference between developed countries and developing countries. Developing countries tend to have weak institutions. What I'm going to do is, through 5 parables, I call them parables because they're broad brush accounts of various problems, I'm going to add an appendix to the book. Sri Lanka is a relatively small island, about twice the size of Vancouver Island, sitting at the southern tip of India. The country has a long history going back about 2.5 millennia, famous across the world in classical times for its pearl fisheries, which provided pearls to the then known world, its spice industry, cinnamon, cardamom, black pepper, elephants, which were used for work and warfare, and of course its very long 2,500-year history and tradition of Buddhism. By the time the first Europeans arrived in Sri Lanka in 1506, about a decade after they got here, the Portuguese arrived on the shores of Sri Lanka. The country's great history was already in its past. The civilization had collapsed, rather like it did quite suddenly at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the island had been reduced to an agglomeration of warring princedoms, not very prosperous at all. India, by comparison, at that time was flourishing. As at 1600, India accounted for about 20% of world GDP, compared with the US share of about 26% right now. So extremely prosperous country by comparison. The Portuguese and the Dutch governed Sri Lanka for the most part for about 3 centuries. And then at the turn of the 19th century, the British arrived. We were fortunate, again, unlike India, which fell into the clutches of the British East India Company, Sri Lanka became a British Crown colony. While it's always necessary to remember that colonialism was bad, there were better forms and worse forms of colonialism. Sri Lanka suffered one of the better forms. At the very outset, the British made it clear that their object was to ensure the prosperity of the nation through generally increasing the prosperity of natives, a very uncolonial sentiment, observed more in the breach, of course, rather like all men are created equal over here. But the British paid attention to education, and this was an important thing, because they came into this country that was desperately poor, had no real functional economy, and then they set about modernizing it. And so that brings me to my first parable, the paradox of how education and democracy combined to cause a civil war. I'm sure most of you have heard that Sri Lanka had a civil war. And the man that caused it, poor chap, was Samuel Newell, an American Baptist missionary who found himself in Calcutta to start a school in 1813. Now, 1813 was the Anglo-American War, and so he wasn't very welcome in Calcutta. He was deported, together with his wife and daughter. And they were sent off to Mauritius, where unfortunately his wife and daughter both perished, they died, and he sought refuge in the southern Sri Lankan port of Galle. The British had no choice but to take him in, and unable to decide what to do with him, they sent him to the farthest possible outpost of the country, the northern peninsula of Jaffna. Now, it so happens that Jaffna is where about 10% of the population of Sri Lanka lived, who belonged to a different ethnic minority from the majority. The Tamil people in the north and the Sinhala people in the south. The Sinhala now account for about 70% of the population. The Tamils probably for about 20. There's been a bit of change in the last 2 centuries. And Newell began educating people, children, in Jaffna. The British, meantime, themselves had committed to education in the south, Sinhalese people, and here they set up schools in the tradition of British public schools like Eton and Harrow, which in fact are elite private schools. And so the British concentrated on teaching the Sri Lankan children the Greek classics. They became excellent in Latin. They were taught to write fine English prose, never to complete a sentence with a preposition or split an infinitive. Up there in the north, the American Baptist tradition was very different. They were teaching science and mathematics. So guess what happened? The kids in the north had a huge advantage when it came to getting into university and finding jobs, whether it was in medicine, engineering, law, public service, civil service, and so on. And by the time we got independence, 10% of the population that were Tamil had 30% of places in university. There was a massive disparity. In 1931, the British were so trusting of the Sri Lankans that they gave us universal franchise, 3 decades before you had it here. Just 3 years after they had it in the UK itself. And we were able to elect our own governments. Now the tables suddenly turned because the Sinhalese majority found we've got 70% of the votes. And it's time to get even with the minority that's been besting us at everything. And so a civil war that cost 100,000 lives, that was the result. A small disparity a long time ago had massive repercussions 150 years later. The second one, the British, in developing the country, did what they do best, which is find all the rainforests there were and cut them down and start planting coffee. And large areas of the Sri Lankan hills were transformed into coffee plantations. Throughout the 19th century, coffee plantations flourished across the country until the mid-1870s, when a leaf blight fungus caused their collapse. In the meantime, the British had started investing in tea plantations, and so the failing coffee plantations were transformed into tea, which left the British hungry for capital because they had to invest all the available funds they had in making this transition from coffee to tea. And of course, today Sri Lanka remains famous in the world for tea. At the same time, over here, you are in the middle of the Civil War. And the Civil War led to a modest increase in demand for a substance called rubber for waterproofing clothing for the soldiers fighting in the war. Rubber at the time came from Brazil, from the northern province of Pará, and attempts to cultivate rubber in Brazil failed because the species just had too many natural enemies in Brazil. As a result of that, rubber cultivation in Brazil never took off. All the rubber had to be extracted from the wild. In 1866, soon after the Civil War, the Amazon was open to steamers, and steamers could go 2,000 kilometers up. Sorry, I think in kilometers. I hope that's all right for you. 2,000 kilometers upriver to bring wild harvested rubber. But of course, it was a resource that could not be sustainable because it was being harvested to death. Over in England, they were watching the movement of this industry with some interest. Rubber still hadn't become a major commodity, but it certainly seemed to have some promise, especially in the wake of the Civil War here. So in 1876, Joseph Dalton Hooker, the director of Kew Gardens in London, decided to send a young man, at least he was young then, a 20-year-old bloke, to Brazil with an instruction that he should bring back some seeds. Henry Wickham returned to Kew Gardens in 1876 with 70,000 rubber seeds from Brazil. These were planted out in hothouses in Kew, and 2,000 saplings resulted. These were carefully packed onto a ship and sent to Ceylon, to Sri Lanka. And there they were planted out, and within 8 years flourished and started coming into seed. Sri Lanka now held the only resource of rubber outside of Brazil. And then in 1888, fortuitously, Dunlop invented the pneumatic tire. By 1900, the US was producing 5,000 automobiles. By 1914, it was producing 500,000. This huge growth in the automobile industry and the consequent demand for rubber was manna into the hands of Sri Lankans. Now that coffee and tea plantation industry in Sri Lanka had largely been the work of white people, of British colonists. But I told you that Sri Lankans had been educated throughout the 18th century, throughout the 19th century by the British. And so they had now found jobs in professions and in public service, and a middle class had arisen. Now, the thing that defines a middle class is the fact that you have savings. I see that this is a matter of contention even in the upcoming presidential election in this country, the creation of a middle class and its flourishing. And so Sri Lankans who now had savings transformed their savings into capital by investing in the rubber industry. And rubber took off in a massive boom. So successful was the industry that they went off to London to raise even more capital to get this industry up and running. By 1911, what had been a sleepy port in Colombo, in a tropical country, became one of the busiest in the world. Sri Lanka was handling 9 million tons of shipping in 1911. It was the 7th busiest port in the world, the 3rd busiest in the British Empire. And then, through the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, the rubber, tea, and coconut industries kept Sri Lanka going, all the way until 1942. In 1942, the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, and by now the British had planted rubber also in Myanmar, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and the French had done it in French Indochina. But the Japanese grabbed it all. And Sri Lanka now became the principal supplier of rubber to the Allies, principally the United States, in 1942. Again, we took a different tack to India's. The Sri Lankan government, now almost an independent state with its own democratically elected government, decided that they would side with the Allies, with the US and the UK, fight shoulder to shoulder. And so we agreed to give America our rubber at the pre-war prices. Prices by now were through the roof because the Japanese had taken up all the rubber. And we reached out to the West by doing that. India's response to the war was quite different. Mahatma Gandhi chose that very moment, August of 1942, to demand that the British should quit India, or else the Indians would side with the Japanese. Japan by now was knocking on the door of India in East Bengal. So we distinguished ourselves from India in a third aspect. The problem came shortly afterwards. In 1948, we got independence from England. And by 1951, just 3 years later, the Korean War was raging and China entered the Korean War. The United States then went to the UN and got an embargo on rubber exports to China. Sri Lanka was now in a very awkward position because China by then was an important market for the country for its rubber. And the British were still colonizing Southeast Asia between them and the French. And they effectively stopped rubber exports to China. Now we were the only potential supplier of rubber to anyone again. And so the Sri Lankan government asked the United States if they would buy their rubber at whatever the market price was. After all, we'd helped the US through the war. The answer was no. If you want to sell us the rubber, we'll buy it at the price we can buy it in Malaysia. And Malaysia had tanked by then because there was a huge glut of rubber. They couldn't export their rubber. The Prime Minister of Ceylon, 3-year-old country, comes to Washington to plead with President Eisenhower, please change this decision. The answer was no. So Sri Lanka had no option but to export rubber to China. The consequence was that America imposed sanctions against the country. They invoked the Battle Act against Sri Lanka. Aid to Sri Lanka was suspended. The export of agricultural chemicals and fertilizers were stopped. And American and British shipping was prohibited from calling in Sri Lankan ports. This happened to a 3-year-old fledgling westward-looking democracy that had pinned its hopes on a liberal capitalist future. And so even while Sri Lanka had done what it had to do for the West during the Second World War, it was stabbed in the chest by the US very early at the time. So we had no choice but to break the sanctions and export rubber to China. By doing so, we fell into the clutches of the communists, of course, China, and later the USSR, because at that time, without friends in the world, in the West, there was no option but to turn to the communist world. The Cold War had seen the planet dividing into 2 camps. Betrayed by the West, we turned northwards. The 1950s happened to be a time of great flourishing for the USSR, a very brief moment in which they did well. The hydrogen bomb in 1953, and then towards the end of that decade, Sputnik, Laika into space, the dog, and then Gagarin. The US was the country to watch, and the USSR. And the USSR captured the imagination, not just of Sri Lankan politicians, but of people. 75 years ago, but that legacy lasts to this day. Just 2 weeks ago, we elected yet another Marxist president into office. And so, of course, the country, unlike Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong, the powerhouses of Asian capitalism, missed the bus yet again. Of course, we have only ourselves to blame. But I'm trying to help you understand why failures like this happen to developing countries. Now, I told you about Henry Wickham being sent off in 1876 to Brazil to bring back those 70,000 rubber seeds. He returned to Kew with 70,000 seeds, which he legally exported from Brazil, but without the informed consent of the Brazilian authorities. They didn't know that the seeds of this endemic species from Brazil was now going to be taken and cultivated in British colonies all over Asia. And so it turned out that by the outbreak of the First World War, Britain's Asian colonies were producing more rubber than Brazil. We'd overtaken Brazil by then. And this is how, of course, biopiracy gets started. It's one of the earliest instances of biopiracy that I can find. And throughout the 20th century, we saw many more examples like this. For example, drugs like quinine and artemisinin, which come from plants in South America and East Asia. Vincristine, which was for decades used to treat non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from Madagascar, and so on. By the end of the 20th century, it could be said that 11 of the top 25 pharmaceuticals in the American market were derived from natural products, and these were earning about $18 billion for pharmaceuticals companies by then. These are all medicines that you're familiar with. And a sentiment arose amongst well-intentioned people in the West, people like you, that there should be a fair and equitable distribution of benefits between the pharmaceuticals companies who are earning those billions and the countries from which those biological products originated. In 1991, there was a hugely charismatic example right here in the US, where the PCR process, the polymerase chain reaction process, used a bacterium from Yellowstone National Park, Thermus aquaticus, to make Taq polymerase, which is a part of the PCR process. It transacted for $300 million in 1991. Today, PCR has intellectual property worth about $5 billion a year. Yellowstone doesn't get 1 cent of that. But people thought it should. And so a sentiment arose that there should be a global convention, a convention on biological diversity that regulated access to biodiversity for commercial purposes. That we should have a network of laws which ensured that the benefits of biodiversity were equitably shared by the users on the one hand and the owners on the other. And that we should have agreements to enable the transfer of materials and so on. In other words, biodiversity came to be treated as green gold. And biodiversity rich but economically poor nations were told that there were billions to be made. In 1991, this is an important year, which is why I'm focusing on it, Merck signed up with the Institute of Biodiversity in Costa Rica to explore the flora of Costa Rica for medicinal compounds of economic interest. The same year, a movie appeared, this time starring Sean Connery, the original James Bond, who goes off to Brazil and discovers a cure for cancer in a species of ant. The thing is, movies might sound like entertainment to us, but they also can be hugely influential. I'll give you an example. Shortly before the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in 1989 came the China syndrome. It really captured the imagination of the American public and helped to craft national policy towards nuclear energy in the 50 years since. The legacy and attitudes you have to nuclear energy in America today are largely the result of those incidents in 1989. Anyway, the nations of the world gathered in Rio in 1992 and signed up to this convention. The expectation was that after this was signed, pharmaceuticals companies would scramble like refugees after loaves of bread to get their hands on biological resources, and there would be agreements signed between biodiversity-rich developing countries and the West. But it didn't happen. Now, more than 30 years later, the Biodiversity Convention has been largely an empty promise, a damp squib. Why? Because those 11 pharmaceuticals that we talked about as being derived from natural products were derived from natural products that were not just as common as dirt, but dirt. Soil bacteria, gut bacteria, common fungi, and so on. There was no opportunity for sovereign ownership of any of those origins. But the US did its part in herding the whole world to sign this convention in Brazil, the promise of shared benefits. And the nations of the world, especially the developing world, rushed like lemmings over the cliff, as directed from Washington, to sign the convention. Having done that, the US itself stood back and said, I don't think we are going to sign this one. And to this day, America hasn't signed. What was not made clear to those naive third world leaders signing up in Brazil was that the discovery of products of substantial economic benefit in biodiversity is vanishingly rare. It's what I think of as a high-low risk event. High impact, low frequency. Examples like Taq polymerase coming from Yellowstone might happen once every half century. But on a day-to-day basis, scientists all over the world in those biodiversity-rich countries need to access biodiversity, to study it, to research it, to conserve it, to do the taxonomy, to do the conservation. And now the Biodiversity Convention had effectively locked them out of the resource that they strove to conserve. An iron curtain descended between biodiversity on the one hand and those who strove to study it and conserve it on the other. If we craft our daily lives on the basis that we should regulate ourselves expecting a meteor strike or a tsunami or an earthquake today, you'd never get the kids to school. And that's precisely what the Biodiversity Convention did. It failed in short order. Costa Rica's INBio by 2015 was insolvent and had to be taken into government receivership. Merck itself walked away from Costa Rica, having assayed more than 10,000 substances from Costa Rican flora. It put it all in the public domain and said, we're not interested, help yourselves. There simply was no there. And by then, the damage was done. The baby had been thrown out with the bathwater. And today, across the developing world, whether it's Brazil, Central Africa, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, or the Philippines, access to biodiversity for scientific research, even for conservation, has become extremely difficult. In Sri Lanka, I'm working with a colleague of mine who explores the flora, and he's, in the course of his decade of exploration, discovered 220 species of plants, of flowering plants, that are putatively new to science. They need to be described and named. This can no longer be done because the access you need to biodiversity to transfer specimens across borders now, to take specimens and examine them with comparative material in Kew or here in the Missouri Botanic Garden, for example, is out of the question in the light of the regulatory framework, the noose that has been tied around biodiversity. Moving on. Sri Lanka by the mid-1990s, found that there was a remarkable increase in the number of people with chronic kidney disease. The people with this disease, in their tens of thousands, more than 400,000 people contracted chronic kidney disease, tens of thousands died. We may never know the actual number. But as you see here, this was in a geographically quite discrete region. And so it was thought to have something to do with the geography. And indeed, there seemed to be a correlation between kidney disease and groundwater, fluoride, for example. In the past 30 years, the problem has disappeared, largely because we prevent people from drinking groundwater now, and people have clean water to drink, so this is no longer an issue. But in the mid-2010s, it was a very serious issue indeed. Each year, we were seeing the publication of more than one scientific paper a week on this problem. Huge amount of scientific interest in the problem. The answer was never found. But in the middle of all that, in 2014, this gentleman, Professor Jai Sumana, professor of pharmacology, published in an obscure journal a hypothesis in which he implicated glyphosate, Roundup, the weedicide, as being responsible for chronic kidney disease. The paper, nobody paid attention to it because it was clearly presented as a hypothesis. But Professor Jayasumana had some social heft because he was an activist and a politician as well. And although Sri Lanka's National Academy of Sciences publicly declared that they could find no science to back up this claim, neither had this hypothesis been tested. In fact, it hasn't been tested in the 10 years since it was published. The government prohibited the use of not just glyphosate, but also other herbicides like glufosinate ammonium. Within 2 years, the rice harvest halved in Sri Lanka. Maize went down by 20%, and tea was losing about $200 million a year. I might not think $200 million is a lot of money. It isn't, except when you consider that tea is grown in Sri Lanka by 400,000 smallholders. And if you divide those two numbers, you find that each smallholder on average lost $500 a year. For a person living on the edge of poverty, $500 is a big deal. While this argument raged in Sri Lanka, into the fray stepped the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, which bestowed its Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award on Professor Jayasumana. This, mind you, you all know what this institution is, the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society. That's what it calls itself. And in awarding that honor to Professor Jayasumana, here's what it said. It claimed that glyphosate is a lethal and deadly herbicide. It said that Jayasumana had solved a medical mystery. He hadn't, he just offered a hypothesis. We can all do that. And it said, as a matter of fact, that glyphosate was transporting arsenic, cadmium, and other heavy metals to the kidneys of those drinking contaminated water. All of these were absolute lies, if not hyperbole. But it shot Jayasumana now to credibility and to fame. In short order, he was made a cabinet minister and eventually the Minister of Health. Having become the Minister of Health, he now discovered another paper from 2015, 5 years before, this time where he claims that phosphate fertilizer is what's causing chronic kidney disease. And now, with the AAAS behind him, he was a credible scientist. All other scientists in the country had to shut up. And so the government banned the use of fertilizers. In other words, by now, we had denied modern agriculture altogether and taken Sri Lanka back to the 19th century. And of course, the whole agricultural system collapsed. Within 12 months, the central bank announced that it was insolvent. It couldn't pay its debts. The country was bankrupt. 1 year later, food shortages, the shortages of commodities, saw hundreds of thousands of young people coming to the streets and protesting against the president, who was forced to flee the country and resign. I want to mention this protest in particular because I'm so proud of these young people. It saw, in a time of desperate need, hundreds of thousands of youngsters coming out and protesting absolutely peacefully. The worst excess that they committed was jumping in the presidential swimming pool. And having got rid of the president without a shot being fired, they only asked that the Constitution be honored, and they went home. Very different from January 6th. Well, what of the AAAS? When they made this statement in 2019, I was amongst the first people to write to them as a scientist from Sri Lanka and say, you've made a terrible mistake. These statements are completely misinformed. Please appoint at least a scientific committee to find out for yourselves that you are mistaken and make an announcement that you are in error or you stand to do great harm in my country. I had no reply. I submitted a carefully worded, respectful, and polite opinion piece to Science. It was rejected without review. But what did the AAAS do? This, the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society. Without a word to anyone, they made the web pages relating to this whole story disappear. Thanks to archive.org, you can still go and look it up. But 1 year after they did the damage, there was no apology, no correction, no admission of culpability. In one of the worst episodes of misconduct in recent years, scientific misconduct, the American Association for the Advancement of Science betrayed Sri Lanka yet again. And to this day, they walk with impunity. Finally, last year, this one might annoy a few of you, but hold on. The Ornithological Associations of North America decided that all birds that had been named after people, there are many such things, whistlers, warblers, stuff like this, would be renamed because some of those people after which birds had been named had been associated with slavery or the colonial enterprise. Now, I think we all know that thousands, tens of thousands of species all over the world are named after people. These are commonplace names. Many of those are named after bad people. But the question is, where do you draw the line? Should we rename the unit of power because James Watt was associated with the slave trade? If you look at all the other thousands of eponyms that float around, leaving the birds aside, should we rename Pennsylvania because William Penn was a slave owner? Or rename the name of this great nation because Amerigo Vespucci was a slave trader? This didn't seem logical to me. And so I knew that when America starts something, the disease quickly spreads to the rest of the world. And I was amongst the first scientists, probably the only one from the developing world, to publish an article saying, hang on a minute, isn't this colonialism all over again? Because you're dictating now to us, the colonized, that we must change tens of thousands of names of species in our countries just so that you can assuage your conscience, salve your inherited guilt. And I said, we've got better things to do with our time. Because the fact is that the West and the East have very different sets of values. I see representatives of both those in this room, so I think I'm preaching to the converted. But you understand that this concept that white people in America have, that somehow because slavers were white people, they share the guilt of those people 200 years ago. In the East, we have no idea where you're coming from. Because this idea of original sin, of inherited guilt, is very alien to the way in which we think. There is no concept like that outside of this culture, the Judeo-Christian culture of the West. In Sri Lanka, there are more than 50 species of plants which are named Walkeri. These are named after a woman called Anna Maria Walker, who was a botanist in the 1830s in Sri Lanka. She went around botanizing in the island, carried by 4 native bearers, which was the way British people got around in them days. And these men carried her all over the country. There weren't just 4 of them. There were 16 because they had to work in shifts. She was obviously a large lady. And so this wasn't her, by the way. I'm illustrating a palanquin, so because you might not be familiar with this. But someone remarked to her that the men who were carrying her around looked like small horses as they were carrying her around. And she said, actually, you'd be nearer the mark if you called them black cattle rather than small horses. This was something she wrote in her diary, which was published some years ago. And of course, you all recognize that it's deeply offensive. Of course it is. It was very much the culture of the time, but even by the culture of the time, she was out of place, I suspect, because we know from the writings of British colonialists in Sri Lanka in the 1830s that their attitudes to the native people were very benign compared with this. And so the question arises among Sri Lankan people, should we rename those 50 species of plants that are named after this horrible lady? There's not one Sri Lankan I have spoken to who agrees with that proposition. We just don't care. Why does it matter? So the point I'm trying to make is, even as I know this is a terrible thing for me to say, but even as we in the West try to signal our virtue by saying we want to push through initiatives like the renaming of species in the name of decolonization or anti-slavery, much more important is if you pay attention to the actual needs of developing countries, actual needs of the countries from which those slaves came in the first place, and try to address those problems, rather than, quite hypocritically, looking at the possibility that words might somehow set you free. They won't. Deeds will. And so I take those 5 examples in this brief time to illustrate my contention that small actions on the part of Western countries can have huge consequences for developing ones. Partly because of that original thesis of Acemoglu and Robinson, that developing countries fail because their institutions are weak. Of course, we have only ourselves to blame. No one's pointing a finger at anyone else here. But it pays us to understand, and always when we impose our values on others, to think it conceivable that we might be mistaken. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your very insightful talk. We can take questions for the remaining 15 minutes if anyone is interested. Questions or discussions, things people want to share.
Thank you so much for coming and giving your talk. I'm also want to applaud you for being very brave to come to Yale specifically, which is kind of a wasp's nest of DEI. So one of the issues, like you said, is there's better and worse colonization. I also think there's better and worse DEI. And it seems that whenever you disagree with any kind of DEI mission, you're instantly labeled as a conservative or as a racist or a bigot. And so that doesn't actually reflect just disagreeing with somebody's ideology. So my question to you is, have you come across any ways to portray to people that you just disagree with them, but you don't hate them?
Of course, I don't hate anyone in this debate. I think DEI should be viewed as an aspiration and not an ideology. If we make it a set of goals and targets that we want to aspire towards, of course, it's a good thing, but in getting there, we need to be cautious. The example I gave you from Sri Lanka of how affirmative action can be reversed to harm a minority shows that even something like affirmative action can be harmful. We have to be cautious, as noble as the ambition of diversity, equity, and inclusion are, to make sure that we don't do harm. And I think even as we roll out policies like this in the West, and increasingly so in the East, we have to be sensitive to the harm that can be done in some countries. A more telling example might be the harm that has been done to gay rights in many developing countries as a result of the rhetoric used in the West to affirm gay rights, as important as that is. But now we see in developing countries, even in Russia, one country after another clamping down on people they deem to be subversive because of their sexuality. So I think as important as espousing those principles is and living by them is, to impose them as an ideology on others is fraught with danger. And I think we need to be respectful about that.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for your talk. And thank you for sharing the history of Sri Lanka and linking it to global political history. my question was like going forward now that we're in the age of climate change and we are moving beyond just looking at national institutions to fight this challenge and looking at global institutions. How do you see developing countries getting a say in global policy making? And I just don't mean in terms of the West taking historical responsibility and giving us sharing resources to fight this, but being at the global table where policy frameworks are made. How do you see developing countries taking a role in that? Because as I see it right now, even like with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, there's like an added objective where European Union is like, we are doing this so that we incentivize the developing countries to start taking initiatives to reduce carbon, but they didn't get any say in this policy, and a lot of them have opposed this. So how do you see global institutions now playing a role in like nation building?
I think we've got a long way to go before we get there. If you take my country, for example, our emissions per capita, carbon emissions equivalents, 1/17 that of the United States, 1/17. You are trying to get to where we are already in terms of emissions. And so the challenge for the future is to make sure that we don't increase that 1/17 beyond where it is. How do you do that? You help us to develop through clean energy. That has not happened. It was promised in Paris in 2015. It's been promised repeatedly after that. And frankly, when I speak to policy makers in my country, the argument is what we're looking at COP29 this year. If it didn't work for 29 times, it's probably not going to work on the 30th. So there is a lot of despondency and cynicism about the whole international climate negotiation program. It's just that the developed West doesn't want to pay the price of cleaning up the global atmosphere and expects developing countries to do an unfair part of the work. There is also hypocrisy in this. Whenever you buy some item now made in the developing world, as much of your produce, pretty much all the clothing you're now wearing was made in the developing world, you choose it because the label says something about low carbon or something to do with sustainability or bamboo or some wool. The issue is that people in the developing world are paying a high price in order to, again, help you solve your guilt in the name of climate. The most important thing that the West has to do is to make sure that countries whose energy demand is growing rapidly, developing countries, develop clean energy. But there is no transfer of funding whatsoever from the West to the South to make this happen. And there's no sign that it's going to happen anytime soon. It's been promised repeatedly at one COP meeting after another, and it just doesn't take place.
Hi. Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for speaking. I have a similar question along that line with CBD. I feel like generally talked about as something that's really positive for biodiversity. And so it was really important, I think, to hear this context for it. And I'm curious if, somewhat similarly to COP with the UNFCCC, if you think that CBD can be reformed or if you think that there needs to be a whole new system because its roots in colonization are too deep. Thank you.
I think the CBD can't be reformed, and the damage it's done is going to take a very long time to reverse, because countries don't easily shed legislation. And once they've got regulations and legislation out there, to shed it is very difficult. There again, the problem of institution comes into play. Because in developed countries, you can regulate access to biodiversity through CBD-like mechanisms because you have strong institutions that are responsive to public needs. In the developing world, institutions don't care what the public thinks because the bureaucrats who sit in those offices are a law unto themselves in every developing country. You can take any one of the 120 nations of the world which would be termed developing. And by definition, they cannot manage the regulatory burden imposed on them by the CBD to think positively about the difference between access to biodiversity for research or education and access for commercial use. Commercial use over the 30 years has been proved to be absolutely empty. The CBD has a secretariat in Montreal, and I bet, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would eat my hat If the global revenues from all benefit sharing agreements over the last 30 years, since the CBD came into effect, if those global benefits are greater than the cost of running the secretariat in Montreal, I really don't think that that equation, that circle will ever be squared. It's a tough one.
Fascinating talk. Thank you so much. So I've been to Sri Lanka a couple of times. It's a beautiful country, absolutely beautiful nature. And generally, I think it's hugely underrated as a tourist destination, to be honest. So in your opinion, if you were king of Sri Lanka, you know, what would you do to improve the country and its state? Like, what do you see as opportunities for the country? What do you see as the political way forward? Obviously, you mentioned Marxism before not being good for the country. What would you do?
So if I were the king of the country, I'd start printing some dollars. I can't do that. But it's a country with a massive deficit and very high social services. We have universal healthcare in Little Sri Lanka, which you don't have here, and healthcare outcomes that are better than Louisiana and Mississippi in terms of infant mortality, maternal mortality, and so on. So we spend a lot of money on caring for people. We have universal free education, including university. So with this enormous input of social services, it's very difficult to make a balanced budget. So we always run at a deficit, borrow lots of money, and then end up being unable to pay it. That is the basic predicament of Sri Lanka. We didn't earn the money before we started spending it. And now you can't reverse it because it means taking away privileges that people have. You can't take health and education away from people once you've given it. So really, it's a pretty hopeless situation, I'm sad to say.
So I have a two-part question. The first is maybe more of a comment, but I want to get your take on it, which is, as a biodiversity scientist who studies plants, it's my understanding that the issues with identifying new species are really due to a overwhelming lack of funding for taxonomic research in this day and age, and more of a focus on different types of studies. So just the funding isn't there, and the training of botanists and natural historians on the ground is also not there. And that, I would argue, is the larger issue when it comes to identifying new species. So I'm trying to frame that as a question, so I'm just not making a comment. But I'd love to hear your take on that. And then the second part is this idea of using the forest as a source of medicine goes back to this idea of making the forest more valuable standing than cut down. And that's something that the world is grappling with now. How do we do this? How do we value these forests? And so that they're more valuable standing than cut down. And we talk about this with carbon or with biodiversity credits. And I can see us going down the same path, and it ending up being a total disaster like you've talked about. So how do you see ways around that given current options?
Sorry, both excellent questions. Thank you. I disagree with you on the first premise. I think taxonomy is not expensive, especially because most of the work being done in taxonomy the world over is done by amateurs. People do it for the love of the game rather than because they paid for it. It's impossible in the present world to get a job in taxonomy. You do it because you are a banker or an engineer or something, and this is a part-time occupation for almost everyone. The money gets spent because if you want to do molecular taxonomy, for example, it costs money. But I know and work with about 25 taxonomists across Sri Lanka and India, and all of them do it on a shoestring budgets, and they do very good work. The big problem they have is accessing comparative material. Because of our colonial past, all the type specimens pretty much of species of Sri Lanka and India are sitting in either Kew Gardens or the Natural History Museum in London, or sometimes here in the Smithsonian. And to access those, you can't even loan specimens now because the CBD regulation doesn't let you do that. So even when it costs nothing, it doesn't happen. The second point I think is more interesting, and I'm going to try and cover that as quickly as I can. But there again, I have a different perspective. The valuation of biodiversity in terms of dollars, or monetization of biodiversity, is something that makes sense in the Western context. Because you, thanks to your Judeo-Christian tradition, have been given dominion over biodiversity. You may not be Christians. I suspect most of you are atheists, but you are still inheritors of the tradition that has been given to you by Genesis, where God says, this is yours to do as you will. The Asian perspective is very different. We don't see ourselves as standing at the top of the food chain when it comes to biodiversity. We see ourselves as part of the web. We are just another element with equal status with every other kind of organism on the planet. I'm not saying that people consciously think about these issues, but some of us do. But if you look at the philosophy of Buddhism or Hinduism or Confucianism, it is rooted in the idea of equal status for everyone. This idea that humans are here to manage is not there. And so the monetization philosophy on people from my background, coming from where I do, just falls on deaf ears. We don't understand what you're on about, because we don't look at biodiversity as a monetizable resource. It is our environment. Not to say we're all good actors. People poach animals, they cut down forests, of course, for economic needs. But the idea, for example, that you can hunt animals for sport, this is a very European thing. There's nobody in Asia who would dream of hunting an elephant, shooting an elephant because it's sport. You do it and you justify it, not you lot, because I know you are all diehard liberals. but people do it out here because they feel that this is a mandate, a moral mandate given to them by God. Even if they're atheists, this is the tradition you have inherited. Whereas in Asia, we don't have that issue. So have I answered that question? I think we do that. I mean, about 30% of the land in my country is protected, almost 30%. People have a huge respect for biodiversity and for environment. I think this is part of the local tradition. It's not something new. It didn't have to be foisted on them by the West. It was an integral part of the psyche of ordinary people in our part of the world.
We are out of time, unfortunately. If you have questions for Rohan, please join us out on the third floor so we can let the classroom come in. And another round of applause. Thank you.